Well, we are continuing in Isaiah. Today we're in Isaiah chapter 19. 18, 19, and 20 go together in the sense that the same force that was brought against Ethiopia is brought against Egypt about the same time. And 20 kind of wraps up, and Isaiah becomes a living example of a warning about the destruction that's going to come on Egypt. Again, keep in mind that there's a warning here, implicit warning to Judea and Jerusalem not to go to Egypt and seek an alliance. Again, we're facing the Assyrian onslaught. It's going to come into the northern 10 tribes, sometimes referred to as Ephraim, sometimes referred to as Samaria. It's going to overrun that. It's going to overrun Moab. It's going to overrun Ethiopia. Syria is going to overrun Egypt, and God is letting Judah and Jerusalem know this ahead of time so they don't seek alliances there for their defense, but instead turn solely to the Lord and depend on Him. It's the idea here. Of course, Egypt is constantly in the news today. Egypt is led a war in 1948, and then again in 1973. Against Egypt, or against Israel, but then signed a peace treaty with them, I believe in 1980, and became a strategic partner really with the country of Israel. I've got a quote here. I'll read to you from Eliyahu ben Eleazar, who is the first Israeli ambassador to Egypt. And he said, let me find that quote. Actually, it's the former defense minister, Benjamin ben Eleazar, said of Egypt that Egypt is not only our closest friend in the region, the cooperation between us goes beyond strategic. So we see an alliance between Egypt and Israel here in our day. Did not exist fully earlier. It's always been an on-again, off-again relationship, in my view, between Israel and Egypt, even through biblical times. You know, they fled there. Israel fled there to escape a famine, ended up being trapped there as slaves for 400 years. God liberated them, but Jesus fled from Herod to Egypt and was safe there, so provided a safe haven. And we'll see at the end of this chapter today that there's a brilliant future waiting for Egypt. So let's get into the chapter. An oracle concerning Egypt. Notice this in verse 1 here. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. Well, that's an interesting picture of the Lord on a swift cloud. We see that in the Psalms. Psalm 18, verses 10 and 11. Psalm 104, verse 3, and in Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, talks about the Lord being on a cloud. And what's happening there is the other gods, the false gods outside of Egypt or outside of Israel, were often depicted as storm gods. They exercised their power through storms. And here, as we see Yahweh mounted on a cloud. So he controls these storms. He controls these clouds. And that's what's being communicated here. In this vision of the Lord on a cloud that Isaiah is seeing causes Egypt to tremble at his presence and the heart of the Egyptians to melt within them. So a display of his power brings to the Egyptians fear and trembling. See what God does. He causes civil war in verse 2 of this chapter. The spirit of the Egyptians within them is emptied out, and I will confound their counsel, says the Lord. So what's happened here is they're thrown into panic. They're thrown into fear. Their counselors are ineffective against this. They consult with idols and sorcerers, mediums and necromancers. So they're talking to people who speak to the dead. They're talking to people who supposedly have supernatural powers to understand what's going to happen in the future. And this is all going to prove ineffective because God is going to put them into the hands of a difficult, hard taskmaster. It says the waters of the sea will dry up. There's going to be drought that comes against them. The waters are going to recede. The waters of the Nile are going to dry up. And in verse 7, there'll be bare places by the Nile, on the brink of the Nile. So this is the picture of the Nile waters receding, exposing banks, and they sow in those banks, and they will be harvesting crops from the banks of that very fertile land along the Nile there. Fishermen are going to mourn and lament because their business is going to dry up, literally and figuratively. They'll be in despair. The princes of Zion, begins in verse 11, we're going to be thought of as foolish. So verses 1 to 10, we see this judgment and confusion that comes from God, and oftentimes confusion is a form of judgment that comes from the Lord. Verses 11 through 17 talk about the foolishness of the Egyptians and their foolish idols. The Egyptians were known in the ancient Near East as a people of wisdom. They cultivated wisdom. They cultivated wisdom among their gods. But look in verses 11 down to verse 17, how often we see wise, stupid, fools, deluded. Look at verse 11. The wisest counselors of Pharaoh give stupid counsel. End of verse 11. I'm the son of a wise king, a son of ancient kings. They say, how can you say that to Pharaoh when you're giving him such bad advice? Where are your wise men? Verse 13, the princes of Zoan, which is another name for Memphis, which was a capital in northern Egypt, have become fools. The princes of Zoan have become fools. The princes of Memphis are deluded. Verse 14, the spirit of confusion overcomes them in that day. So now we're looking at, I think, the final days here. Isaiah moves from viewing near-term events that are going to occur in that day, signals the time when the Lord will come back, when the warriors, the mighty men of Judah, will become like women, it says, trembling with fear. They're full of fear. Notice how often this phrase, in that day, is repeated after verse 17. It's repeated in verse 16, again in 18, again in 19, 23, and 24. It's looking for these end of days. And this is going to be specifically a time when, surprisingly, Egypt turns to the Lord. So we're going to see Judah will become a terror to the Egyptians. Everyone to whom it is mentioned will fear because of the purpose that the Lord of hosts has purposed against them. So Judah will be first become a symbol, or will elicit fear in them. They will be fearful of Judah and Judah's God. Verse 18, in that day there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. How surprising. One of these will be called the city of destruction. Some manuscripts call this the city of the sun. We can also call this Heliopolis. This is the center of worship of the sun god in Egypt. So what he's saying here is that this center of sun god worship will be converted to the center of the worship, one of the cities that Yahweh is worshipped at, showing the great change that's happened here. In that day, there'll be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt and a pillar on the border. So again, just a remarkable change that's going to happen here. And this is looking forward, I think, to the time in that day when Jesus reigns on his throne in Jerusalem. Isaiah has already spoken about that time when Jerusalem will be the destination of all the 8 nations in the world that will want to hear and know what God has to say. And I think this is looking forward to that time. Look at verses 23 and 24. It says, in that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and Assyria will come into Egypt, and Egypt into Assyria. Well, that's to be expected. Assyria is going to overwhelm Egypt. It's going to bring them under subjection. So no wonder there would be a highway from Assyria to Egypt. But wait, it goes on. And the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. In that day, Israel will be the third, with Egypt and Assyria a blessing in the midst of the earth. Well, this is amazing. This is amazing prophecy from Isaiah that this enemy of Israel, this country that's been on again, off again, significant in Israel's history as both a place of refuge, a place of slavery, a place of refuge for the Messiah. At some point in the future, Egypt, Assyria, and Jerusalem will form kind of this Mideast triad focused on the worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem. A blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. What a unlikely trio that are going to be pulled together in the last days when Jesus is on his throne. That's just an example of the peace that the Lord is going to bring to the earth and how the nations will turn to him. You know, even at the end of the book of Revelation, we find nations taking their wealth as tribute into the New Jerusalem. So these nations are going to continue even into the end times. So again, so often we've seen in this section of Isaiah, the section that's going over the nations around Israel, we see a warning not to ally themselves, not for Israel to make alliances with these nations, because ultimately these nations' destiny is to come and worship in Jerusalem. Israel should not be seeking alliances with them. They should be seeking alliances with Israel. So it is in our day. If we want to enjoy the blessing of Yahweh, Jesus on his throne during his millennial kingdom, we need to be supporting Israel now. We need to seek alliances with Israel now. We need to secure Israel and pray for the peace of Jerusalem today. That's something that we can all do. We can't all have direct effect on our legislators, but we can all pray, and we can all pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And God will bless us individually, and perhaps he'll bless our nation if our nation continues to support this key strategic country in God's end times plans. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. Continue in 2022 as we make our way through Isaiah. We're making great progress. We're in chapter 20 of 66 chapters tomorrow or the next time. And may God empower you by his grace to continue to drink deeply at the well of his prophetic word. God bless you.